Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Gavoni. I'm the housing planner for the Montgomery County Planning Department. I'm joined today by my boss in the audience, David Onsbacher, who's the Chief of Countywide Planning and Policy. Today I'm going to give a brief presentation about attainable housing strategies, and then I want to hear from you, so I'm going to open it up to questions. One disclaimer is this is a very dense presentation packed with a lot of information, so please feel free after to ask clarifying questions. I'm more than welcome to also talk offline if anyone would like to have a follow-up conversation. So way back in 2021, the County Council asked the Planning Board to consider and recommend zoning reforms that would, quote, allow greater opportunities for missing middle housing in Montgomery County. Attainable housing strategies is that resulting effort through which the Planning Board prepared recommendations to allow the development of more diverse types of housing in the county, including missing middle housing, and we'll talk about what that is in a second. So I'm going to start off with a little of data points that kind of talk about framing the attainable housing strategies recommendations and why we think that these recommendations are important. So first, the average detached home in Montgomery County is getting larger. It's increased by almost 2,000 square feet since the typical home in the 1950s. And this is largely happening through the tear down rebuild process, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is when they take down an entry-level home that's more affordable and build a much larger house that is less affordable than what was there. This is largely done by right, and what by right means is that you can go straight to the Department of Permitting Services, get your building permit. There's no community engagement. There's no discretionary planning board review. It's a by right process. Also in 2023, the average detached home in Montgomery County sold for $970,000. That's compared to $440,000 for attached structures. And I've been giving this presentation a lot, so people always ask what the median is. The median is $900,000 for detached structures. If you look at this chart, you can see that the range at which these structures sold in. So if you look at the blue, you can see that they were mostly sold in the $1 million to $2.5 million category, and the $600,000 to $800,000 range. This is compared to attached structures in that $400,000 to $500,000 range. And we know that size has a big impact on affordability. Naturally, if you build them smaller, they're not going to be able to charge as much as you would for a large detached structure. So I'm going to jump right in to the recommendations. You may remember on the first slide that the request was to look at missing middle housing. And missing middle housing is part of this initiative, but it is part of it, not the entirety of it. So missing middle housing is a term that was coined by Opticos Design that describes a range of house scale multi-unit structures that are compatible in scale and form with detached single-family homes, largely referring to duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. Attainable housing that offers more diverse housing types beyond just that missing middle scale. So it includes things like small apartment buildings, townhouses, and stacked flats. And stacked flats are basically structures that look like townhouses, but they're one unit stacked on top of each other. So I'm just going to jump right into the recommendations. So first, the zones that are applicable. Every parcel in Montgomery County has a zone, and that zone dictates what you can do with that property. In Chevy Chase Section 5, you're all R60. And R60 typically means that you can largely only build a detached structure, a detached house. There are certain exemptions for that. You can also build things like schools and religious institutions and other things through optional method, which is discretionary planning board review, but largely you can really only build detached structures in the R60 zone. So our recommendations really focus on 3 scales, 3 tools, and 3 geographic targets. The first is we're talking about that missing middle scale, those duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes within the interior of single-family neighborhoods. We're also talking about a medium scale, which is a housing structure like townhouses or small apartment buildings through something we call the optional method of development. And the optional method of development requires discretionary planning board or planning director review, which means it's not by right. You can't go straight to DPS. There's some level of review for these projects. And then for a large scale, we're talking about our growth corridors that were identified and Thrive Montgomery 2050, areas of the county that have been identified for growth, places like Connecticut Avenue or River Road inside the Beltway. So first I'm going to talk about the small scale recommendations, then I'll talk about the medium and the large scale, and then some other things like parking and other elements of the recommendations. So that small scale really is that house scale structure. There's the duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, generally in the same form, massing built form as a detached home, just more units than one. They would be allowed in the R40, 60, and 90 zones. You would be allowed to build duplexes and triplexes everywhere, and quadplexes in the priority housing district. And I'll explain what the priority housing district is on the next slide. They would be allowed to be built by right with conformance with the pattern book. And I'll talk about the pattern book in a couple of slides. So basically it's what we're calling a guidebook that someone would have to adhere to be able to get their building permit from the Department of Permitting Services. The development standards, so things like setbacks, height, lot coverage, would be the same as they were the same as they are for detached structures right now. There are no recommended changes proposed for the small scale recommendations on height, setbacks, or lot coverage. There would be some allowance for reduced and on-site vehicle parking. And how would we implement these recommendations? So they would be implemented through something called a zoning text amendment. A zoning text amendment is a piece of legislation similar to a bill, but it only applies to Chapter 59 of County Code, which is the zoning code. A ZTA modifies the standards and the text of the zoning code and makes changes to them. So I mentioned previously on the slide about the priority housing district where you would be allowed to build quadplexes and you would have further reduced parking standards. This shows a map globally, but I zoomed in on Chevy Chase Section 5, and it is entirely in the priority housing district. So what that means is that there would be further reduced parking standards, and I'll illustrate that in a future slide, and you would be allowed to build quadplexes, not just duplexes and triplexes, in the interior of the neighborhood. So next, I'm going to jump into the medium scale recommendations. That type of housing we're thinking about is townhouses, stack flats that I mentioned earlier, and small apartment buildings. They would be allowed to be 3 to 4 stories tall. They would be allowed in the R60 zone within 500 feet of a Thrive Montgomery 2050 identified growth corridor like Connecticut Avenue, or land that's identified for a floating zone in a master plan. So it would be a master plan recommendation. It would be through that optional method of development that would allow that higher density and that greater flexibility in exchange for an additional level of scrutiny for review that would either be reviewed and approved by the planning board or the planning director. There would be allowance for reduced setbacks, increased site coverage, and requirement for public open space. And it would also be implemented through a zoning text amendment that would establish and create that attainable housing optional method and would permit that allowance of that unit type and that type of housing within 500 feet of the R60 zone out of a growth corridor. Like I said, this is a map of the attainable housing growth corridor. You can't really see it. It's a 500-foot buffer of the growth corridor, but I zoomed in to Chevy Chase Section 5, and basically all of these properties in blue along, I believe that's Connecticut Avenue, would be allowed to build up to 19 units of small apartment building, townhouses, or stacked flats. Yes. And finally, for our recommendations, we have large scale. We again are talking about a lot of the same structure types, stacked flat townhouses, but they would be permitted to be built above 4 stories. Again, we're talking about the geographic context of those growth corridors like Connecticut Avenue. And it would also have preliminary and site plan approval process similar to how it is today for development of that size. That also requires planning staff and planning board review. The standards of the zone would follow the similar standards for our commercial residential mixed use of zones that we have today, and follow any recommendations for guidelines from overlay zones like the Bethesda overlay zone. The implementation would largely be through a master plan, so it wouldn't be through necessarily a zoning text amendment like the other two. it would go through a process that I'm sure some of you went through with the Bethesda Downtown Plan or the upcoming Friendship Heights Sector Plan. It would be a years-long process where we would evaluate every parcel for its potential. So in that form, the implementation tool for the large-scale recommendations is very different than the small-scale and the medium-scale recommendations.
Wait, I'm sorry,
Sure.
I don't understand. Are you saying that the process in Friendship Heights and Bethesda is entirely different from this process, and that you would be going lot by lot here, or are you saying that this would be a comparable process with a master plan?
This would be a comparable process to what we go through master plans. Like the Bethesda Downtown Plan was a 3-year, process with a lot of community engagement, a lot of looking at parcels for their individual zoning capacity and talking with property owners in the community. This would be a similar process to that. So I mentioned earlier that there would be some reductions allowed for parking requirements, and I'll just zoom in to the R60 zone.
So we don't have parking requirements. We're already overparked.
So parking requirements are a requirement for all new development. Generally, you are required to have 2 spots per unit. That would be cut by upwards of 75% for the parking minimums for attainable housing strategies. Parking is perhaps the biggest question that I've gotten, not surprisingly. I like to call this portion of the presentation when I get tomatoes thrown at me. We understand that there's a lot of sensitivity around the parking issue. One thing to be clear is that these are parking minimums. They are not parking maximums. So the market is free to provide more parking than it is required. And so I talked earlier about the small scale recommendations requiring conformance with the pattern book. So the pattern book is something that we are developing in line with the attainable housing strategies that would lay out a clear path for getting these building permits for small scale. It would be a one-stop resource for building all attainable housing types within each zone. It would be an easy-to-use tool to review and permit applications that would help facilitate the production and we think add value to these neighborhoods. Some of the elements of the pattern book would be things like massing, the built form, what we're calling neighborly details, things that we think are desirable to see in these types of structures like front porches, where on-street parking, which should be the placement of the building, and frontage design. So that's for recommendations. I want to be, very clear that this is a study, this is an initiative, this is not a zoning text amendment. These are the planning board's recommendations that they send up to the council that are currently being reviewed by the county council. We have an upcoming roadshow that actually starts tomorrow, a listening session with the council president, Andrew Friesen, and the planning director, Jason Sartori, on attainable housing strategies. I've made this presentation available and there's an RSVP link there. These are the upcoming listening sessions that I urge you to attend, and if you cannot attend at this link, there's actually a way to provide comment on these recommendations to the county council.